Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Today's discussion will be on the Indo-Pacific and how it is viewed from the European Union and its member countries.
We've touched upon the Indo-Pacific from a trade perspective. We've looked at it from other regional perspectives, but it's really interesting to see how the European countries have started to look towards the Indo-Pacific and structure their ideas and structure their engagement in a way that is distinctly different from the United States, in particular the former administration under the Trump administration, and how they are trying to articulate what they think is important, why they're engaging in the region, and how they want to engage. And I think that these are really, really interesting questions for us to be thinking about. So just to give you some background, I think, as many of you know, Prime Minister Abe, when he was in office the first time, he talked a little bit about the so-called confluence of two seas. He was bringing together the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and talking about how this was a natural relationship, and it was a relationship that would continue to deepen and grow in the coming decades as the Indian economy came online, it's developed, as the Southeast Asian countries developed, and they integrated themselves into the broader regional economy. And about the same time, I think that we had growing concerns with of assertive behavior within the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and really competition for making rules. But at that particular time, I think when Japan visited Europe, and discussed some of the trends as Japan saw them. Our European friends were very hesitant, or I think they didn't have the same vision about the importance of the Indo-Pacific in their foreign policy. And as a result, they didn't really take the Japanese approach and how Japan framed the Indo-Pacific. But, time travel forward, what we've seen is that many countries to start in Europe, as well as the region, have started to put together their own Indo-Pacific visions and strategies and guidelines. And it was a real recognition that, yes, the Indo-Pacific region and the regional economies here will be the major driver of global economic growth moving forward. They saw that there was a paucity or not enough institutions within the region, and the lack of institutions meant that the rules for how the region is going to develop would be up for competition. So how do we engage in trade? How do we think about intellectual property rights? How do we think about the digital economy? How do we think about governance and human rights and the importance of human rights in supply chains? And what we've seen gradually is that our European friends have said, yes, this region, again, is really critical. We need to focus on helping build the institutions, and that we need to help build the region through the provision of infrastructure connectivity, through strengthening institutions and norms related to human rights, related to good governance, related to transparency. And you probably noticed I didn't say democracy, because I don't think our European friends are out and about and involved in democracy promotion, but rather they believe that good governance and transparency is probably a better measure of development. So what we saw back in 2016, I believe, is our French friends, they put together their Indo-Pacific strategy, articulating why they have a stake within the region. And for the French perspective, of course, they have territories in the region, and those territories mean that it has, a skin in the game in terms of how the region is going to develop. And if it develops against the French interests, then, of course, this is something that the French would not be in favor of. Next, we had our German friends put together something called an Indo-Pacific Guideline. And they don't use the word strategy or vision like Japan. They use the word Pacific Guidelines. And when we look and dig down into their Indo-Pacific Guidelines, some of the key themes that are addressed is transparency, good governance, rules-based behavior in terms of trade and in terms of the maritime domain. And they don't explicitly talk about China or some of the real drivers behind their concerns and how they're articulating their policy, but they were talking about China. And how can we tell? Is, again, they're focusing on rules, concerns about rules-based behavior, concerns about international law being not obeyed, concerns about growing authoritarianism within the region, and concerns about economic models and different kinds of international agreements that really were in some ways unfair or locked countries into a dependent relationship which shifted or changed their thinking. After our German friends put together their Indo-Pacific Guidelines, surprisingly, the Dutch, the Netherlands, put together their own policy framework, which really echoed much of the Germans' ideas in their framework. And then lastly, and most recently, the European Union has released their own Indo-Pacific Guidelines or initiatives. And what we see in the German, the Dutch, and the European Union's focus on the Indo-Pacific or in their Indo-Pacific strategies or visions is that, again, they're focused on concerns about the rules-based order, so how we play the game of international affairs is being eroded. They focus on concerns about growing authoritarianism and on how this could affect governance within the region, and of course how it affects human rights. They wanted to preserve and help with infrastructure connectivity, and they want to be part of what they call the rules-making process and institution building within the region. And this is really important, being part of the rules-based institution building in the region. And you probably will ask, what does this mean? So let's think about trade, and let's think about trade in terms of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP. So some of the core features of the TPP, which really is the most advanced trade agreement that exists right now in the world, focuses on intellectual property rights. It focuses on environmental law, labor law, and limiting the role of state-owned enterprises. So that first area of intellectual property rights is really meant to ensure that businesses can continue to invest in research and development. And by investing in research and development, they can produce the new innovative technologies that are going to shape our economies and, of course, facilitate our lives. But if there's not strong protection for intellectual property rights, most businesses wouldn't invest in research and development. And as a result, we don't see innovative products being developed. So the TPP really focuses on the intellectual property rights as a key driver of economic growth within the region. And the countries that joined the TPP 11, they all agree that there has to be strict rules about intellectual property rights to promote and create a market-based economy that supports innovation. And it can only support innovation when innovation is protected and research and development is protected. So intellectual property rights is part of the institution building. So what kinds of economies do we want to have? The second area was the labor law and environmental law. So usually poor countries or countries that have less rigid human rights laws, they can use those loopholes in the legal process to lower the cost of production of goods. And of course, that means that they can be more attractive for the market, but it can warp how markets usually work. So a country with a tremendous population that doesn't really have the same labor restrictions and human rights restrictions or protections really can lower the costs of competition and really suck up all the manufacturing hubs, and really all that profit comes back to the host country. So this is seen as unfair, and it's seen as something that warps the market. The third area that I mentioned, or fourth, if we put environmental law and labor law in the same bucket. The fourth is limiting the role of state-owned enterprises. And this is really, really critical in thinking about how we understand how trade and economic intercourse should work. So usually we are hoping for the market to shape competition, and the market to shape research and development, and the market to really shape the outcome of the trade engagements that we engage in. So the TPP presents an institution that limits the roles of states and state-owned enterprises. And it's trying to ensure that it's the market forces that are creating the competition in the market, rather than a state-owned enterprise that has really unlimited resources. And those unlimited resources, again, can create unfair conditions in the market. So when we're thinking about the Indo-Pacific region and how Europeans are thinking about the Indo-Pacific region, is they want to be part of that rules-making process. So they are not locked out or prejudiced against whatever rules emerge. And that means that they're at the table in terms of trying to create and foster institutions. So in the European case, core areas of interest is good governance, transparency, sustainability, environmental sustainability when we're talking about infrastructure and connectivity. They want to strengthen the strategic autonomy of South Asian countries such as India and Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, but they also want strategic autonomy of Southeast Asian countries so that they can make decisions based on their national interests and their region's interests, not based on unbalanced economic relations with one country or the other. So what we've seen in the European context, what we see is that the Europeans understand the importance of being part of the institution building within the region, and they are thinking about how to contribute to the region's stability and how it will evolve moving forward. And what we see is a commitment by the European Union to contribute to infrastructure connectivity building, mostly in the West Indian Ocean. So they're thinking more about the geographic side where they have more proximity and more experience. They're thinking about how they can engage in trade. And we've already seen the European Union engage in trade agreements with Japan in the Japan-EU Economic Partnership, but also in infrastructure and connectivity with the Asian Infrastructure and Connectivity Agreement that the Europeans and Japan signed. And we see growing interest in trying to contribute to how the maritime domain, so the South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan Straits, and the Indian Ocean is being governed. And hopefully, and what I think many Europeans hope is that it will be governed by international law and the United Nations law of the seas. So they're strongly promoting those areas because they understand that economic prosperity throughout the region is largely going to be based on how well sea lanes of communication are governed by a shared set of rules, not the rejection of international law. So in 4 quick points, I think how we can understand the Europeans' engagement in the Indo-Pacific region is focusing on good governance and development. And these are interlinked, so they want to promote good governance rather than promoting, I think, democracy or changing the political system within the region. And that's intentional because, of course, many of the partners within the region are not democracies. And if the European Union starts talking about democracy, they're not going to get buy-in from Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos or Myanmar or, frankly, China in terms of their engagement within the region. So good governance and development are really critical for Europe. They see the development part as developing markets for future consumption of European products. And that development is attached to the second area that I think is important in terms of the Europeans' Indo-Pacific engagement, and that's infrastructure and connectivity. So helping build roads, helping build bridges, helping build digital infrastructure, growingly health infrastructure, so that this region can be more interconnected. And the belief here is that the more integrated the region is, the more self-sustaining the economies can be, and that it will enhance development. So that's the second area that I think is really important. Third, again, is contributing to and trying to ensure that the maritime domain remains governed by international law. And when we look at the Indo-Pacific guidelines or the European Union's Indo-Pacific strategy or the Dutch strategy or the French strategy, really seems to be a lot of overlap and synergy in terms of how they're thinking about the importance of international law being the final arbiter of how we deal with problems in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Taiwan Straits. Lastly, and I think importantly, when we're talking about the European approach, one area that I think there's been quite a dramatic shift in is Taiwan. We see the European countries very proactively and explicitly talking about the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. And the peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits is meant to really focus on ensuring that whatever future China and Taiwan decide for themselves, that it will be one of mutual compromise and mutual agreement. And for the Europeans, they see that this is a growing concern in terms of the direction of China's policies towards Taiwan and how this potentially could affect broader supply chains within the region and the broader economy. We should always remember that the European Union does a tremendous amount of trade within the region, and not just with China, but with Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asian countries. And they have a vested interest in ensuring that the region remains stable, peaceful, and, again, arbitrated by international law rather than a might. And they are growingly investing in and trying to send the signals that they would like to ensure that whatever happens between Taiwan and China, that it happens peacefully and without coercion or conflict. And this is going to be an area of increasing difficulty for the Europeans and their Indo-Pacific engagement, simply because Taiwan places is such a central role in China's identity, in how it thinks about its future. And again, I think the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party in terms of how it is really built an identity in the post-World War II period or the post-Civil War period, that it was the party that defeated defeated the Japanese. It was the party that rebuilt China, and it's the party that has gradually putting back China together after the 100 years of humiliation. And Taiwan is really the last piece of that puzzle. And for the party, an independent Taiwan would be really a difficult reality to swallow. And this is why we see such strong language on Taiwan, but real consistent language on Taiwan over the past 40 years, that the government, whether it's Xi Jinping or Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin or Deng Xiaoping, they've really reiterated the same point about Taiwan, that they support peaceful reunification, but they wouldn't rule out the use of force if necessary. And that really hasn't changed. And I think that's an important thing for us to be thinking about. So that's just some framing ideas to talk about how the Europeans are thinking about the Indo-Pacific. But I'd sure like to welcome some of our Polish friends and other European friends on the call. So I see Barbara, I see Karina, I see Chao Ting, I see Anna, and others. I'd love to hear some of your comments of how Europe or your particular countries are thinking about the Indo-Pacific.
So maybe I start. I would say that we do not have an Indo-Pacific strategy as a Poland. More, we can talk about the EU Indo-Pacific strategy and see some implication for Poland from this from the view of the EU towards Indo-Pacific. So maybe I'll start with a question: why the EU has adopted this Indo-Pacific strategy currently? Mainly because other done so. So we have the US Indo-Pacific strategy, the Japan Indo-Pacific strategy, as Stephen has mentioned, but we also have some Indo-Pacific strategies of selected European countries, like France, like Germany, like Netherlands. So the EU decided to adopt policy paper on the Indo-Pacific, mainly because of the economic relevance of Indo-Pacific for the European Union. And I would say also that not only this economic ties like trade, investments are important for the European Union, but also it's important that Indo-Pacific it's important in the context of global challenges like climate change. The Indo-Pacific is both an important source of global environmental challenges and a potential beneficiary of mitigation measures. The region's share of global carbon emission has increased in recent years, and the region will account for the more than 70% of the increase in the global energy demand by 2030. So we can see also the Indo-Pacific in the context of these global challenges. That's why this region, not only for economic reasons, is very important for the European Union. In the strategic documents published recently by the European Union, we can read that Europe and Indo-Pacific are natural cooperation regions in the context of trade and investment. So maybe I'll stop here and Karina add something else.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt, Stephen.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you. I'd rather open up the floor to discussion. If you have a specific question, I'll try to answer it. Anna, do you want to jump in?
Yes,
Karina.
Okay, so I just maybe add one point to the original question and about Poland and maybe more broadly Central and Eastern Europe and Indo-Pacific, the point is that this particular region, the so-called V4 countries, have generally lesser economic and also, let's call it, strategic interests in Indo-Pacific than most Western European economies. This is like one point, but on the other, this is something that seems to be changing, but maybe not necessarily from Polish perspective. It's mostly Czech and Slovakia that show some interest in Indo-Pacific as such. If we look at Poland, it will still be the point on Asia-Pacific, which is actually still the point given the importance of China for the region. And this would be it from my part for now, at least.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Karina. Thank you. And I think it's really important for us in this discussion to remember that the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific can coexist. They're synergistic, and that I don't think we have to choose one or the other. And I do know that there's some people that frame it that way, but in reality, I don't think that is actually correct. I think that they coexist. And when we think about the Asia-Pacific, we generally think about it through the Asia-Pacific Economic Community, and those institutions really don't represent South Asia at all. India, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan and Bangladesh are not part of APEC. And in that sense, I think that the Asia-Pacific concept represents a certain group of countries, but the Indo-Pacific represents a broader group of countries that has really come online in terms of their economic presence. And that is really important. And I think that the Indo-Pacific framing, of course, there's a geopolitical element to it, but I think it also represents, again, this South Asia coming and being much more integrated into the Asia-Pacific economy, and that we need a new framework to try and institutions to deal with the challenges and opportunities emerging in this region.
And we've got Barbara as well, also Chao-Ting.
Thank you for the talk. It was actually very interesting to listen to you. What Anna and Karina mentioned a lot of, I think, the main points, but what I would like to look at is, I think, the timing of it all. The EU is kind of very late to the party, so to speak, because I think in a lot of ways it was waiting to see how viable the concept itself was going to be. And we could see this very slowly kind of transitioning from just the strategies of individual states, so France, then Germany, Netherlands, UK, and then EU kind of very late decided, yes, they needed to engage. But basically, I think that a lot of the engagement points are the same ones that have been kind of basically copy-pasted from earlier engagement with the Asia-Pacific. So EU and I think Europeans in this case are not trying to reinvent the wheel here, and instead just trying to basically keep the focus on their own interests in the region. So basically especially the of course trade engagement and maintaining more or less the peaceful environment. I think that's kind of what I would look at here when it comes to European perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. And I would agree with that, but I do think it's also important, as you mentioned, that the Europeans have come late to the game. I think the only country that's probably even later to the game is South Korea. And that's a whole other discussion. But they are late to the game, which means that, and the old expression is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I think there's a realization that they have to be involved in how this region is going to develop. They, of course, I think, concerned when the former president of the United States was in power and how it was a highly securitized Indo-Pacific strategy that would create challenges for how European countries engage within the region and engage with their big trading partners like China, Japan, Korea. So I think there is realization that they have to be in the region trying to contribute to how it's going to develop to secure European interests, as broad as those are. I also do think that there is been a shift within the European Union in terms of a realization that what happens in the region does matter, that they need to be really thinking about how a regional integration structure that really is dominated by, in this case, an authoritarian state, could prejudice the Europeans and some of their core values and how they think about issues within the region. And here I'm thinking about, of course, the Uyghur issues and other human rights issues. These are not trivial matters for our European friends, and I think that they are increasingly concerned about, where the region will be going if it's dominated by an authoritarian state or it's dominated by a securitized China-U.S. relationship. In that sense, I echo what I said before, is that, again, they feel it's important to try to ensure that the region isn't hyper-securitarized and that they push back against authoritarianism, but they're also involved in developing the region for economic opportunity.
Thank you for that. And then Chao Ting, can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, I can.
You're
Okay,
based
thank you,
in
Steve.
Germany, right? Yes. And
Yes.
Hi, Chao Ting. Thanks for coming again. It's good to talk.
Okay, thank you for organizing this discussion. I think it's very interesting that we discuss the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. I think today's focus is about the European perspective toward the Indo-Pacific region, right?
Yes.
So yes, I understand EU has published its Indo-Pacific strategy in this year, and before that, European version of Indo-Pacific strategy, some member states of EU, such as France, Germany, and Netherlands, have published their Indo-Pacific strategy respectively. But they are quite different from my perspective. The French Indo-Pacific strategy was published by French Department of Defense, and the German guideline of Indo-Pacific was published by German Foreign Ministry. For Netherlands, I don't know. For Dutch version, I'm not sure. So my question is about the possibility of one unified EU Indo-Pacific strategy. I know EU has published its Indo-Pacific strategy, but I don't think EU is in the position to design and implement a unified Indo-Pacific strategy, because EU is too diverse, and it's very difficult for EU to have one unified geopolitical and geoeconomic strategy toward the Indo-Pacific region, which is also very diverse. So it's very difficult for EU to do that. Let's take Germany as one example. Germany is only one member state of EU, but even for one nation state like Germany, it's very difficult to have one unified China policy, right? So even for China, for one single country, Germany is not in the position to form a unified China policy. The new German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, is obviously different from his foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock from Green Party. They have different attitudes toward China and even Indo-Pacific region. For Annalena Baerbock, her focus is to promote a value-based foreign policy. But Olaf Scholz seems to continue the pragmatic foreign policy toward China. They have difference, obviously. And I mean, at the national level, German federal government is not in the position to form a unified China policy. And between subnational level and national level, they have difference as well. Many communications, many exchanges between China and Germany takes place not at the national level, but at the subnational level, and they are independent. They are independent from the federal government. So, I mean, even for Germany, such a nation state, it's really difficult to have one unified China policy. And for EU, it's much more complicated than Germany. So, and for example, Hungary and Greeceland probably have different positions in terms of China. So I don't think Brussels is capable of making compromise or consensus among so diverse EU member states. So this is my question or my doubt for the EU Indo-Pacific strategy. So what are your comments? I really look for your comments.
Thank you, Chao Ting. I would agree with your analysis in that I think that there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the European Union, in terms of its policies towards the region, policies towards China, and prioritizations. And I think that you highlighted one country, Hungary in particular. We see Hungary has, I think it's using its China relationship to try and as leverage with to deal with some of the challenges within Europe. And I think that has been probably not as beneficial as it could have been. But I think it illustrates your point is that to have one European Indo-Pacific strategy that has teeth, that is very proactive, in particular in the security sector, our security realm is going to be really, really, really difficult. And simply because it will probably take consensus between all the European states. And we know that Greece has an economic relationship with China through the acquisition of the port. We have Italy, which has strong BRI connections, and at least this current government is seen as quite close to China, and Hungary as well. And these three states represent, potential points of fraction or divisionism within Europe in terms of taking or crafting a substantially more impactful Indo-Pacific strategy. So in this point, I really agree with you. My sense is we're probably going to see a less ambitious European Indo-Pacific approach moving forward because of these divisions. And we'll probably see countries themselves have their own national approach to dealing with the Indo-Pacific and working with specific partners. And I think the UK is probably the best example of this, but I think that we're also seeing France and the UK, building and negotiating reciprocal basing rights with Japan, which is part of their Indo-Pacific engagement. So I think that we're going to see quite a few different levels of Indo-Pacific engagement, but not very well integrated and strong Indo-Pacific strategy from the European Union itself. But again, we have lots of people on the call that can share their views on this. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Lynn, go ahead, Lynn.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Stephen. So to me that during your talks, you really emphasize the trade opportunity aspect. And to me that the idea of creating a free and open Indo-Pacific is really beneficial for all participants because it creates a healthy and equal economic cooperation opportunities. Then when talk about like the EU strategy to the Indo-Pacific region, I could think about the case of Southeast Asian countries because in Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations also adopted this vision about Indo-Pacific. However, it seems to me that individuals, countries in Southeast Asia still like have different understanding of the Indo-Pacific. For example, in Vietnam, I would say that when talk about the Asia-Pacific, there is quite a lot of information. But when talking about the Indo-Pacific, I think that is still a very new ideas in Vietnam. So I don't know that. So when think about the reluctancy of Southeast Asian country when receiving the Indo-Pacific vision, I think that I would think about the China's factor. However, when it's come to European countries, I do not know what the possible reason that make some individuals member in the European may be reluctant to join this vision. Because I think that the idea is very good, that is create free and open Indo-Pacific. It promotes rule of law and freedom of navigation, and it provides a lot of economic cooperation opportunities. Then why there is still like hesitancy in some countries?
Thank you, Lynn. So I think that this is the challenge, and I think Chao Ting brought it up in his point, is that there's a lot of heterogeneity within the European Union in terms of how they think about governance, how they think about human rights, how they think about engaging in the region. So I think our Hungarian friends are probably a case in point, is that they have a very interest-based approach to how they engage in foreign policy, and they don't prioritize human rights in the same way as other countries. And as a result, their approach, they have quite strong relations with China, and they've been courted by China, and this has benefited Hungary in some ways. I think the same with Italy and Greece. So there's not uniformity in Europe in terms of how they think about many things, which creates a challenge in terms of a shared approach. Do they all want a free and open Indo-Pacific? I think that it really is what we call a definitional issue. So a lot of countries are moving up there in the Indo-Pacific region and challenged with the Trump administration's definition of what the Indo-Pacific was about. They don't look towards Japan's approach or Indian approach or even ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outlook as their template for how they think about the region. So this is also a challenge, is, what is the approach? Is the European Union thinking, or each particular European country thinking about the Indo-Pacific, and how do they conceptualize their policies based on this understanding? And this is a challenge. And as you mentioned, you made the comparison with Southeast Asia. I think there's many similar dynamics in Southeast Asia as well, is that, as you said, Vietnam has is, if it's a Japanese free and open Indo-Pacific vision, that's probably okay because it's not so securitized. But if it's a U.S. one, while it's very securitized, it'll be a problem. If it's about democracy promotion, it's not going to get buy-in from Laos, Cambodia, Singapore, Myanmar, and Vietnam, maybe from the Philippines. So because of the heterogeneity within the regions, that it's really important to, when they're thinking about the Indo-Pacific, how are they thinking about it? What kinds of framing are they talking about? And what does that free and open mean? Japan is, it's quite promiscuous in its foreign policy. It does trade with all states. Iran, China, Philippines, Indonesia, United States, European countries. It engages in diplomacy with them all, international cooperation with them all. So Japan is free and open is not so much about democracy promotion and human rights promotion. I think it's more about development, infrastructure connectivity, trying to create rules that, preference the Japanese or at least don't prejudice the Japanese. And I think that's something really similar to how some of the European countries are thinking about it.
Yes, thank you, Professor. So it seems to me that China's factor will be a critical thing. So what do you think that if now, for example, China wants to join the CPTPP, and then if China is receptive to the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, so do you think that it will invite more participants to join?
Well, there's not really any joining the free and open Indo-Pacific. It's you have to accept that this idea of you expect a rules-based approach to how the region is governed, and internationalize is that approach. So there's not a joining; it's accepting that framing. So again, the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, at least that the Japanese are advocating, it's not an alliance; it's a way of conceptualizing the region. So in that sense, if China wants to engage in it, sure. On the TPP example or topic, so there's a lot of talk about China and Taiwan applying to the CTPP, and just today our South Korean friends said that they are interested in applying, and I think that China's interest and Taiwan's interest suggests that there could be a door open for all three countries to join. But remember, to join the CTPP, again, it's an institution that has high standards. All the countries need to agree. And I don't think that's likely that all of these countries will be able to join the CTPP for different reasons. I think that Taiwan will unlikely be able to join without China's joining, because China will probably block the application or put pressure on some of the current TPP members. I don't think China will be able to join because it has some challenges with some of its bilateral relations that need to be worked out. And South Korea is an interesting case. Will South Korea be able to join before China and Taiwan? And my sense is probably not, because they worry how China may interpret South Korea joining the TPP if it's a trade agreement that excludes China. And they may, in fact, penalize South Korea. So there's a lot of challenges moving forward on terms of trade moving forward. But pivoting back to Europe, Europe is a really interesting question of how it engages in the region. Will it form new trade agreements? Will it try to join trade agreements? These are all open questions that I think our European friends might be able to shed some light.
Yeah, thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. Thank you. I think Fong has a question or comment.
Yes.
Steve, if you allow me, I have one more question.
Sure, of course.
Okay, so as I have mentioned, also I doubt the capability of EU of designing and implementing a unified Indo-Pacific strategy. I do believe EU can initiate some concrete projects. For example, EU has published its plan of the so-called Global Gateway project. I think this project is really important. Some people have perceived the Global Gateway as an alternative of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Probably EU has a purpose to compete against China in terms of infrastructure. So what are your comments about the Global Gateway project? I have no enough information about the Global Gateway. It seems that the EU wants to focus on Africa, Latin America, rather than Indo-Pacific region. So if the Global Gateway is going to compete against the Belt and Road Initiative, I think Indo-Pacific should be a focus of the Global Gateway. So what's your analysis?
Thanks, Chao Ting. So I think there's a couple points here. First is, there's an argument over form over function, and does the European Union have to actually adopt an Indo-Pacific vision or strategy to actually be involved in the region? And I would argue probably not. I don't think it's necessary to have an explicit approach. And with that, it means that they can be a little bit more flexible in how they're articulating things and developing institutions or approaches like the Gateway Initiative that does provide infrastructure and connectivity, but not necessarily under the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific vision or strategy, or however we want to talk about it. Second, and this is the trend that I see, is that we're seeing growing consensus of the needs of the Indo-Pacific region. So infrastructure, connectivity, development, health infrastructure, good governance, attention to human rights, maritime domain, but countries taking on a regional burden. So what I mean by that is that if the European Union focuses on the African side of development and infrastructure connectivity there, and perhaps they have some help from the Japanese who have lots of experience, that's fine. And the Japanese and Australians and Indians may take up the slack on the Eastern Indian Ocean part of the Indo-Pacific. And then in the Pacific Islands areas, maybe it's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, and Japan that take up the slack there. So I don't think that we have to have a one approach. I think there can be a lot of approaches depending on the countries thinking about where their comparative advantages are best suited and where they can be best leveraged to provide value. So in this sense, I don't think it's contradictory that Europeans focus on Africa and maybe the West Indian Ocean, East African part of the Indo-Pacific, while our Japanese friends and perhaps Australians focus on the Pacific Islands and the Southeast Asia or South Asia. So I think these can all complement each other. And I think that is the growing trend, rather than saying that you have to do something everywhere. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. I think probably the U.S. is coordinating with its airlines in terms of providing alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So U.S. can focus on military and security dimension, but Japan and the EU can focus on economic support and value promotion. For example, you have emphasized that EU's Indo-Pacific strategy is value-based. I think EU and Japan have different emphasis. The US, so probably it's coordinated. I don't know, but I think it's obvious that the EU and Japan are not in the position to provide security and military guarantee in Indo-Pacific strategy. This is the strength of the US, but the US is not in the position either to provide everything what Indo-Pacific countries need. For example, many Southeast Asian countries have complained that U.S. cannot compete with China in terms of economic support. So China has provided a lot of economic projects in Southeast Asia, but the U.S. has focused on military issues. But now I think U.S. has recognized this weakness or problem. That's why they are coordinating with its airlines to provide economic support to the countries in Indo-Pacific region. Recently, I have heard something from Kurt Campbell and the Secretary of Commerce of the U.S. Raimondo. They are talking about of providing an economic framework in Indo-Pacific region. I think this is a signal that the U.S. has realized they are not as strong as China in terms of economic support. So they want to change the situation. That's why they are trying to establish an economic framework in Indo-Pacific. Probably Global Gateway project and Japan's infrastructure investment can be one part of the so-called economic framework. I'm not sure if you know the so-called economic framework. I think this is also very interesting. Probably it's the replacement of the CPTPP. President Biden has indicated the U.S. is not going to return to CPTPP. They have a different plan. They have a new plan. I think that plan is the Indo-Pacific economic framework. So from this point of view, I believe the strategic competition between China and the U.S. in Indo-Pacific strategy has intensified. So U.S. is trying to strengthen the economic dimension of its Indo-Pacific strategy. And China is probably also trying to strengthen the geopolitical and even military dimension of its BRI. So from my point of view, this strategic competition has escalated. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so not to self-promote, but tomorrow I have an op-ed in the Nikkei newspaper exactly on the Indo-Pacific framework, and I think I'm actually quite critical. I think that the United States approach is still not recognizing the the interests of the Indo-Pacific stakeholders in development, infrastructure connectivity, and having the U.S. anchored into the region in terms of a trade agreement. So I'll send that to our WeChat group that you're in as well. But I think it's really important that's an important point that the U.S. recognizes that they need to be in the region, and it can't just be a security footprint. That if they really want to compete with China's comparative advantages, it has to be a comprehensive approach that includes a trade agreement. But I still think that they're not there yet. And yeah, you're right. China has an advantage. It's the biggest trading partner of every country within the region, and that every country in the region wants to continue to benefit from that economic growth. I guess the question that I have is, in my view, I think that China is probably close to the peak in terms of the strength of its economy moving forward, because of demographic issues, because of inequality issues, because of the numerous problems and contradictions within the domestic economy, and it's going to gradually slow. Where the United States, although it has many problems as well, its economy is going to continue to grow quite robustly. And it will probably lead in many, many different areas. So my sense is that there's going to be the competition will intensify in the short to midterm, but gradually I think that China is going to have a problem as its domestic challenges continue to become more complex, and that the government will have to focus on the inward issues rather than the BRI and other more internationally oriented events. And in that sense, I think that our European friends, probably working with Japan, like in the United States, are going to be able to muster some cooperation to provide for the Indo-Pacific needs in a way that I think China will have to eventually pull back a lot of that aid.
Got a message via the back channel. It's not exactly about the European Union, but it's about a piece of news in Bloomberg about a new economic treaty, which is actually promoted. It is being considered by the US. And then there has been an interview with Jean. Let me see where her name is. Gina, yes, Raimondi, yes.
Yeah.
So, and it's about the United States being considering, that new treaty, which is not exactly economic treaty, but still, it's they intend to include Nihon and Japan and Singapore and Australia, New Zealand, and other developed countries, but also Malaysia, Thailand, and others. So I don't know. I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is just a message which came from via the back channel, and then so there is no question actually. This is more like a comment.
Yep.
And that South Korea feels like they may be left out of the treaty. So I don't know whether you have a comment on this or not.
So yeah, it's called the Flexible and Inclusive Indo-Pacific Framework, and it was something that's been chatted about for a while. Gina Raimondi, who's the Secretary of Commerce, came and spoke about it in Singapore 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. But still, I don't think there's any concrete plan. And I think that at this stage, it's more talk than action. And until that trade agreement is signed, if it's a trade agreement, then I think that it's just talk, right? And yes, until we see concrete action, I think that it's really just talk. Now, there is some talk about forming what we call a TPP 2.0. Basically, it's a TPP that represents some of the Biden administration's Build Back Better ideas, and that Japan and other countries would be interested in joining this. But really, that means going through the whole process of renegotiating again, and getting all the stakeholders to jump into the trade agreement. And this is not easy, right? The TPP took a lot of time to negotiate, and initially it started with 4 Southeast Asian countries, and then it became significant when the United States and Japan decided to join it, and of course the United States left. But it took 8 years for it to happen. So I think that we should be very, very cautious when we're thinking about these kinds of new announcements, because I just don't think an announcement is enough. It has to have some concrete, action, and trade agreements are tough.
Right, and Stephen, I wondered, we've got, Karina and Anna and also Barbara, I believe that, all of them are from Poland, but I wondered whether you have some perspective on how the Eastern European countries view the Indo-Pacific region, because we know that, we say the European Union, and some of the Eastern European countries are members of the Union, but still there are quite a few differences, in what they consider to be their values and their economic policies and strategies. And that's why I wondered.
So this is a good question, and I think that, and I've been told by many diplomats in Tokyo from Eastern Central European countries is that, they don't want to choose between, China and the free and open Indo-Pacific. They want to benefit from both relationships, especially the smaller countries, right? They don't really have they don't have anything to really complain about, except, they do have some concerns about some behavior. But ultimately, they want to have strong trading relationships with China. And, for them, a securitarized Indo-Pacific region could create real challenges. Now, when we look at the Central European states, I'll start there. I think, China has made some inroads to the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, helping build infrastructure, helping create jobs, investment. And as I mentioned, we see that with Hungary, Italy, Greece in particular. And that has been relatively good for their countries, and they want to maintain that relationship because it has an economic benefit. So we don't see those countries taking strong stances on some of the issues that Germany or France or the UK might. The Visegrad countries, and again, Barbara and Karina and Anna, you might want to speak to this. They have more nuanced views about China and the Indo-Pacific region. So China is an economic opportunity. And, I'll give you an example when, the Russians started to ban or stop the import of apples and things from Poland. It was the Chinese that bought up those apples and they delivered them back to China. So there's an opportunity there. But I think increasingly we see, Poland and some of the other Eastern European countries proactively thinking about how they could get the benefits from both of these mega agreements or mega initiatives, the BRI and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. And that means that they're thinking about how to, again, engage with both initiatives. And then we see our Chinese friends and our Japanese friends proactively reaching out to these countries to try and, lobby them to, get on board with their view. But I think ultimately they want to not have to choose. They want to get benefits from both relationships. And I think that's going to continue. To something that I think is actually will complicate things more is, right now we know we have our Russian friends are at the Ukrainian border, and the concerns about a potential conflict along the border raises concerns for the many of the Eastern European and European friends about making a choice. And their focus is on their border and not so much on the Indo-Pacific region. And this creates, again, I think, a lack of bandwidth to be able to engage in the immediate concern and the long-term, what we call structural changes in the international order that are based primarily in the Indo-Pacific region. And that's going to be a difficult balance moving forward.
I see. That's interesting, yes. But
we have Dr. Mukesh, or Chao Ding, and then Dr. Mukesh and Fong.
Okay, sorry, Stephen. I have a short comment.
Sure.
I'm sorry, so I don't agree with your comments about the Central and Eastern European countries' attitude toward China. I think the situation is exactly opposite. If you are talking about the Southeast Asia countries, it's true that they don't want to take sides between U.S. and China. They want to have one hedging strategy. But in the Central and Eastern European countries, the situation is really very different. We have seen some Baltic countries, such as Litauen, they are trying to enhance its relationship with Taiwan. Recently, we have seen diplomatic conflict between China and Litauen. And other Eastern European countries like Czech Republic, and Slovakia, they have also sent a parliamentary delegation to Taiwan, which is very sensitive to China.
Yeah.
Taiwan is a bottom line, is a red line, but they have sent their delegation to Taiwan, so this has angered China. So I mean, it seems that Eastern and European countries are taking sides of the U.S. I think the reasons are very complicated. Probably these countries are afraid of Russia, and if there is Russia invasion, so they don't expect that Germany or Brussels can protect them. So they are looking looking at the U.S. That's why they have taken sides of the U.S. In terms of the U.S.-China strategic competition. And another reason is probably they have the history of the communist rule. So they are very critical toward China in terms of ideology. So maybe this is a reason why they prefer to choose sides of the U.S. So this is my analysis.
I think, Chao Ting, I think we're actually on the same page of the book. I agree with your comment that the Eastern European states in particular are focused on Russia. And I think I said that in my comments. And as a result, they don't really have the diplomatic bandwidth to support all these Indo-Pacific initiatives. And I think that they have taken a more pro-US position. But that pro-US position doesn't necessarily mean anti-China. On the Taiwan issue, I think in case of Lithuania, and I think some of your listeners may know, they did what other countries have. They agreed to making I think it was a Taiwan representative office, if that's the right name. And I think that our Chinese friends thought this was an upscaling of bilateral relations. And of course, this is cascaded in a very negative direction. As you mentioned, the Czech people have formed strong relationships with Taiwan. Again, as you mentioned, because of their strong views about communist states or totalitarian states. But by and large, I think if you look at the statements of Hungary or Germany or France, Italy, they've been pretty quiet on this. I think even Bulgaria, Romania, they've been pretty quiet about these kinds of issues. And as a result, I think that it's probably more complicated than the picture we're painting.
Fong, are you still there?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Nagi, for your sharing. I'm sorry, I think I missed some of the points that you meant, like when you mentioned about Taiwan. I recently, when I asked a Taiwan expert about the possibility of a contingency in the region, like in the Taiwan Strait, he said that China doesn't see Taiwan as a priority, and Japan is still support the one China policy. But I personally think that when considering several sides in the region, I don't think Japan is I think Japan is moving forward, moving out of its one China policy, and I think especially with the action that Japan brought the security of Taiwan straight into its defense white paper this year, and also by August, with the four lawmakers from LDP had talks with Taiwan's DPP, and also when Prime Minister Suga met with President Biden and they mentioned about the security in Taiwan Strait. So I just want to ask for your opinion or any of your comment about the fact that Japan brought the security of Taiwan Strait into its defense white paper. Does it mean that Japan wants to signal or signal some warning for China, or it is really prepared for a real contingency in the Taiwan Strait? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hong. I think, and I've written quite explicitly about this, I think that whether it's former Prime Minister Abe's statements about something happening across the Taiwan Straits would be a security issue for Japan, or the statements about peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, I think that these are not an escalation or assertive behavior on the Japanese side, but a statement of reality. If there was a conflict across the straits, that this would affect sea lines of communication, and it would probably affect the regional economy quite seriously. And this would affect Japan. And Japan has, huge, I think 32 or 36% of its exports go to China. That's about $210 billion US dollars. They have a lot to lose if there's a conflict across between Taiwan and China. There's concerns about what would be China's intentions in terms of broader regional hegemony. And again, I think the strong message that the Japanese are sending is that we support the status quo. We don't support independence by Taiwan, and we don't support forced reunification by China. We support, again, the status quo. And I think that is the message. I don't think the defense paper has deviated from that approach. I think that is probably a really important message that the Japanese would like to send to both Taipei and Beijing, that they don't support, again, these independence or forced reunification. And if there was some kind of issue, that it would naturally affect Japan's security interests, and that they would have to intervene alongside with the United States and likely Australia and UK and other countries as well.
Thank you. And do you think it will make do you think that the action that Japan made would be considered a factor when China think about moving forward to annex Taiwan into its I don't know, I'm sorry, I cannot find the word, but
To unify with Taiwan?
yeah, sorry.
So I think that Japan and China are very adept at communicating each other's intentions through a very selective choice of words. And I think that the strategic policymakers understand the messaging. The question, I think, for us all is, within the Chinese context, views about Taiwan are unanimous in terms of that it should be part of China again, and the sooner the better. I think that, as my friends in China have said to me, the hawks are in ascendant in terms of their influence within the administration, and this is a challenge. How can the state make the right choice, which is probably just be patient, instead of being pressured into doing something with regards to Taiwan that would have really serious repercussions. But in my reading, I think if you look at, again, Xi Jinping's and all the previous leaders' statements about Taiwan, they've been pretty consistent in saying that we prefer peaceful reunification, but we'll use force if we have to, and that they're really trying to wither down the Taiwanese so that they'll come into mainland China of its own volition. Whether that'll happen or not, I don't know. My last comments on this is I think that the political cycle in China suggests that China will not do anything provocative on Taiwan, at least for 2 years, I think even longer. We have the Olympics, the 20th Party Congress next year in the fall, and China's economy is going to continue to slow down, and a forced unification would further that slowdown and create a lot of domestic problems, and that's not what the Communist Party has on its mind every day. It's on its mind is how to keep the economy going, how to deal with the contradictions within the economy, and how to ensure that those contradictions don't create social pressure that creates large-scale instability that would likely result in broader domestic instability in China and perhaps a change in government. So that's my view. I'm not so, I guess I have a more sober assessment about, I think, the future of a forced reunification or some kind of Taiwan contingency.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And Mukesh, are you there?
Oh, yes, your voice was very feeble. Good to be here. Bit late here, although I should be hitting my bed, but I found this conversation to be intriguing. So I have a few questions, but the first one that I have is, what is your take, or what's your analysis about what is going to be happening to the supply chains since we are moving into sort of a post-COVID world? What will happen to the supply chains? Will they be the way they were? Although we are seeing great shortage of the chips, and then therefore there's a lot of disruption. So yeah, if you can share your view on that, and then I'll follow up with a few more questions, please.
So thank you, Mukesh. So I think in terms of supply chains, there's a lot of talk about decoupling from the United States and China. I don't believe that. I think that what we're likely to see is selective diversification of supply chains away from China, and that's driven because of geopolitics, because of cost, and because of non-traditional security challenges and black swan events like COVID-19. China has unique advantages that really can't be replaced in the short to mid-term. It has a seasonal workforce of 300, maybe 400 million people that it can move in and out of the manufacturing center to build the Christmas presents or whatever country's celebrations you have. And that's not going to change. The cost is cheap. They have the skilled labor, and they have a stable governance. And this gives it unique advantages that just can't be replaced overnight. So I don't sense a dramatic shift. But what we are seeing is, for example, technology supply chains being incrementally rerouted through Japan and through a trusted set of countries. I think that will accelerate moving forward. The question is, which countries will those supply chains, those tech supply chains, move? I think we'll see also medical supply chains also reroute and be more. We'll see more supply chains through trusted partners, so that supply chains aren't weaponized. And I think that we'll see also supply chains shift on rare earth materials as well, because these are seen as critical areas that can be used or weaponized. So I think that is the general trend. But I think that if you look at the surveys by the Japanese Business Federation, AmCham in China, European Chamber in China, Canadian Chamber in China, despite all the problems, all these business federations want to be part of the Chinese miracle. They want to be part of the 400 or 500 million middle-class consumers that are emerging there. They see opportunity. And they want to find ways to make money off that. And I think that's not going to change.
Okay. Okay, cool. So in your view, Stephen, then COVID hasn't changed anything. It's just that, it was a phase and that's it. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
No, I think that there'll be, again, selective diversification to deal with, again, medical supply chains are going to be reshored as much as possible with trusted partners. This is because of the COVID experience. COVID experience, again, has taught countries that they need to have a bit more diversity in supply chains, and we're already seeing that resilient supply chain initiatives being targeted for Southeast Asia and South Asia. But this can't happen overnight. The production network and supply chains that have been built in China took 40 years to make, and this will not be replaced in 5 years or 10 years. It's going to take decades. So I think that we should put it in the context of how long it took to get here and how long it will take to reconfigure those supply chains so that we can have a better balance and protect against not just the geopolitical stuff, but I think growingly issues related to transnational security issues, natural disasters, and transnational diseases. I think those are the lessons that we've taken from COVID-19 and how it'll cause a shift in supply chains.
Cool. Also, other thing, you have touched upon Indo-Pacific. So in Indo-Pacific, is it that we are considering the security aspect? If you're considering security aspect, then definitely it is about AUKUS. But then if you're looking at Quad in Indo-Pacific, and obviously within that there is a role of India, but we're also hearing such a tragic, and I may consider tragic to be a bit of an understatement in this case. So with the kind of with the loss that Indian CDS has seen, so how do you view, does it change the dynamics, or how do you see Quad and AUKUS working in tandem with each other, or they will be having a different sort of operation, probably will not be working with each other? So a bit more understanding I will appreciate if we can share, please.
Okay, so I think I see the Quad as 2 layers of institutionalizing in Indo-Pacific, and as you noticed, Europe is not part of that, and Japan's only part of the Quad. So AUKUS is a deterrence agreement, so nuclear submarines that will be built over a long period of time that will enhance the deterrence capabilities of the UK, the United States, and Australia to really inculcate some deterrence into the Indo-Pacific region, in particular the first and second island chain. There's the second layer is the technology side, which is really trying to create a firewall where these 3 countries, and I assume that it will expand in terms of technological cooperation, but they understand AI, quantum computing, cybersecurity as really key technologies that they must master in order to ensure that the region evolves along the lines that European countries and those countries would like to have. So that's how I understand AUKUS. The AUKUS sits above, the American alliance system, and then below that I see the Quad, which has really evolved towards providing public goods to the region. And we've seen that with vaccine development and distribution, with infrastructure connectivity, and cooperating on key technologies. Of course, there's a maritime security component to the Quad, but I don't think that is its central focus anymore, because it just couldn't get buy-in from our Indian friends. I think there's limits in terms of what the Japanese will do in terms of the regional cooperation. And as a result, I think the United States decided to push forward with countries that were more forward-leaning.
Cool. And how do you see this event of, you may have missed answering this one, the recent event of the chief of defense staff and his helicopter basically blowing up into flames?
It's very tragic for India, and I think for Indian leadership. And it's always a loss when I think any country loses its political leaders. But I don't think that it's going to broadly affect the trends within the region. Although it may reinforce a sense that India has many internal challenges that it needs to deal with to be a reliable partner moving forward. And I know that's unfair criticism as the technology failed, but I think it fits kind of the larger narrative of some of the challenges that many countries feel working with India, is that it's it's the great hope, has great potential, but not necessarily as lives up to its potential.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
I'll
Please.
be around here, and then I'll probably doze off.
All right, I'm going to doze off soon. Thanks for the great question.
Cheers.
you.
Cheers. Enjoy. Bye.
And we've got Tomoko.
My question is very small. I'm just wondering, what do you mean by the supply regarding the supply chain? What do you mean by medical supply chain issue? I don't really get the image of what do you mean by that?
Okay, thank you, Tomoko. That's a great question. So you're based in Japan, right?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So you remember just when the pandemic started and there was a mask shortage?
Okay, so you mean from the mask, because the medical supply chain for me is like a ingredient for the drugs and the equipment for the Da Vinci kind of thing. That's why I'm wondering, what do you mean by that? But in the area, okay, I understand.
Yeah. So it can be everything from personal protective equipment for doctors and for us to the ingredients that go into pharmaceuticals to ventilators and other forms of technology that are used to take care of us during a crisis. And I think that this is, again, less about China per se, but a realization that those kinds of capacities, there has to be an indigenous capacity to build this equipment as well. And as a result, I think we're going to see some of those medical supply chains reshore or be concentrated in so-called safe countries.
Okay, because many of the ingredients are actually from China. So
And this is
as well as China, and as well as India, actually.
Yep.
And in Japan right now, there's no just because of the shortage of the ingredients, just because of the logistics issue and the regulation, the violation of the regulation by Japanese companies issue are more severe than ingredient issue right now. So that's why I'm wondering what you mean by that. And thank you very much for your clarification.
Thanks, Tomoko. That's a really great question and a really important comment. Thanks for your contribution. Thanks. I think it was great to hear from Anna and Karina, Chao-Ting, Barbara, Fong, Mukesh, Tomoko, Lin. It's the engagement what creates the knowledge on this kind of clubhouse, and we can all learn from each other. And I learned a tremendous amount from all of you in every engagement. So thanks again, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomoko.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karina.
Hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
お疲れ様でした。
お疲れ様です。
Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.